In 1983, a large-scale recession was about to hit the video game industry. $3.2 billion of revenue was snuffed out to just $100 million by 1985. The crash was attributed to oversaturation of consoles and poor games with little to no quality control, but this crash only really existed in North America. Over in the UK, the video game industry was thriving. Thanks to home computing, the crash didn't exist. Game consoles like the Atari VCS weren't popular in the UK at all. Instead, it was the ZX Spectrum, the Commodore 64, the BBC Micro, and Amstrad with the CPC line. Home computers have one major advantage over game consoles. They are an open platform. By simply turning one on, you are greeted with a blinking cursor. The machine was yours to explore and write code on, and with an assembler or a machine code monitor you could hit the hardware directly, get access to the chips, the registers, peek and poke memory, see what the machine was capable of doing, maybe even write your own games in the comfort of your own bedroom. You didn't need to have a formal computer science degree or work for a large computing company, you could do it yourself. Many computer magazines at the time would provide listings of source code for small games. Painstakingly, you'd type them out, save them to cassette and then play the game. You'd get bored of it after a few minutes and maybe modify the game to add some cool sound effects or graphics. You'd be learning to code without even knowing. At the time, publishers such as Ocean Software, Codemasters and Mastertronic would pay good money for games. The bedroom coder is part of the fabric that made 80s home computing in the UK. Many industry legends got their start from the magazines and coding out of their bedroom. Grassroots homebrew development would push the industry and drive innovation in games. Back then, programming was accessible and making games was fun. But eventually, 8 and 16-bit home computers had phased out and the landscape shifted to game consoles. The bedroom coder no longer existed. Companies like Nintendo and Sega had very strict publishing restrictions and meant that their game consoles were a closed platform. The price of development kits also ran into tens of thousands of dollars. In 1997, 3 years after the launch of the PlayStation, Sony introduced the Net Yaroze and aimed to bring back the bedroom indie coder, but this time it would be on a console. The Net Yaroze allowed amateur developers a chance to code and write games on the hottest game console around, on PlayStation hardware, the same system that ran Ridge Racer and Final Fantasy VII. The word Yaroze means let's do it together, and the idea for a consumer-grade development kit came from the father of the PlayStation himself, Ken Kutaragi. The idea was to bring back the bedroom coder, the hobbyist, the two friends working out of their garage, and come up with something innovative and cool. In some ways, Sony's ties to indie development can be attributed to the home computing era in the UK. Popular games developer Psygnosis was one of the very first acquisitions by Sony. Known for Wipeout, Lemmings, Colony Wars and the Formula 1 series, Psygnosis started out in 1986 making high-quality games for the Commodore Amiga. But the core group of coders in Psygnosis all originated from Imagine Software, a very well-known British game developer that quickly rose to prominence but under mounting financial pressure closed its doors in 1984. Although Kutaragi had approved the idea, getting it off the ground took some time and it took the Japanese some convincing. Paul HOLMAN, the current VP of R&D at Sony, was in charge of the Yaroze UK division at the time, laid out the foundation. Paul grew up in the UK writing code on his BBC Micro in his bedroom, so his vision was to bring this to a 32-bit console generation, and also a way to bring in fresh new talent into the industry. Sony's Net Yaroze kickstarted homebrew and indie games development on consoles, long before the original Xbox was modded and certainly before XNA appeared on the Xbox 360. The Net Yaroze was a gateway to a new world, and it was entirely legal. The really interesting thing about the Net Yaroze was it wasn't something that Sony had advertised as something that you could buy in a retail store. It was something that was kind of talked about and advertised in magazines at the time, but it was something that was only available via mail order. In order to get a hold of a Net Yaroze and start writing code, you'd need to spend some cash. $750 US or £550 in the UK to be exact. But the Net Yaroze was not available in retail stores. Instead, you'd fill out some paperwork and send a check to Sony Computer Entertainment. From there, you would get a response in a couple of weeks, letting you know that your interest had been registered and your order was being processed and would be sent in the mail. The money spent would allow you to become a Net Yaroze member and access all the bits you needed to write your own games. When your package finally arrived and you opened it up, you would find a special Net Yaroze PlayStation console, 2 controllers, an access key, a communications cable and a power cord. There was also a development kit, 2 CDs and manuals. The SDK uses GCC under DOS of all things. The communications cable was just a serial cable that interfaces with your PC and allows you to send code to the Net Yaroze to debug, test and run your code. Development on Net Yaroze required you to be familiar with C. At the time, C++ wasn't an option. Taking a closer look at the console, it looks exactly like a PlayStation 1 but in black, and it looks absolutely gorgeous. This was the big leagues now. If we take a look at the back of the unit, the only main difference between a retail PlayStation 1 is the serial connection port for debugging. And internally, it almost looks exactly the same as a PlayStation 1 motherboard, albeit with some slight differences and modifications. The Net Yaroze also has different boot ROMs, lacks region lockout, and has a different encryption scheme. The access card is essentially a dongle and is placed into memory card port 1. Its usage is to boot programs that were loaded from the PC. If you don't have the access card, then you can't load games from your PC to the Net Yaroze. While many people bought their own Net Yaroze, the hardware made its way into schools and universities in the UK, teaching students about computer games technology and 3D graphics. HOLMAN and Sony supported the move and even offered schools the hardware at discounted prices. In one of the most famous stories, the University of Abertay Dundee in Scotland had its computer games technology course designed by members of DMA Design, well known for Lemmings and GTA. Over in Japan, Net Yaroze courses were offered as well, and the hardware in that region also sold particularly well, with many developers making interesting and exciting games for the system. Least popular was in the US, but it certainly wasn't a failure. Sony was pushing the hardware in all 3 regions, with numbers reaching several thousands. But perhaps the culture of the 8-bit micro and HOLMAN's influence and commitment in the region was what made the UK stand out. Another membership perk was access to an exclusive Usenet forum for collaboration. Developers would share games, tricks and tips and code with other developers including Sony employees. When I spoke to Net Yaroze developer Ben James, who authored 8 Net Yaroze games, he stated the following. The Net Yaroze Europe community was very small by today's standards but enthusiastic and committed to the platform. We communicated via Usenet groups set up by SCEE, especially for Net Yaroze developers. Given the very limited options for distributing Net Yaroze games, your main source of feedback was from other developers in these groups. So $750 or £550 in the UK gets you a PlayStation 1 development kit. This is a piece of hardware that allows you to write games for the PlayStation 1 in the comfort of your own home with your personal computer that you had at the time, and via a simple serial cable link-up method, you're able to push code to the Net Yaroze, debug your code, and write your game. So what's the catch? What is the major difference between the Net Yaroze development kit and a PlayStation 1 traditional development kit that costs thousands of dollars more? The Net Yaroze hardware was a DevKit, no question, but it came with some limitations over traditional PS1 DevKits at the time. For example, it was missing libraries that would allow you to access the CD-ROM drive. There was only a very simple amount of debugging options using GDB and no access to Sony's main development support. Only the Net Yaroze Usenet groups, as we mentioned before. These groups were also restricted by region, but perhaps the biggest and most widely known limitation was the RAM restriction. The Net Yaroze comes with 2 MB of RAM, the same as a retail PlayStation 1. But by design, you couldn't play burned CDs, and the SDK has no way to access the CD-ROM drive. Therefore, the games developed were limited to fit into the 2 MB of RAM available, and there was no simple way to stream assets from the CD. This restriction only allowed for simple games and demos to be developed. But even with the limitation in place, there was still some impressive stuff that was being done. So back in 1997, if you had a Net Yaroze setup in your bedroom, this is typically what it would look like. Obviously, the flat screen panels weren't really a thing back then, so just imagine this setup with two CRT monitors or displays. But essentially, your PC was where you'd be writing code on, and then you would be transferring that via the serial cable over to the Net Yaroze. There was a particular program called Cyocons, which would then just transfer your executable and your DAT files over to the Net Yaroze for debugging and testing purposes. Now, as you can see, it was a fairly rudimentary setup. It was traditionally typical of development environments back in those days. Things were done with serial cables and parallel cables, but this was essentially the kind of the bedroom style indie setup that you'd be using if you had a Net Yaroze setup back in 1997. Setting up the hardware to develop code on is pretty simple. Connect the serial cable into the back of the PlayStation and the other end into the PC. Plug in the access card into memory port 1. This allows you to load and play games from the PC to the PS1. Install the SDK onto your PC, and then on the Net Yaroze use the boot disk that comes with the SDK. This screen is waiting for the PC to push a game to it. From here, if you did everything correctly, you can now compile code on your PC using the SDK. This is a very simple Hello World program. When we use the make command, we can build the executable and then use the communications program to send it over the wire to the Net Yaroze. But perhaps the biggest limitation of the Net Yaroze is that there was no player software designed for it. In other words, if you wanted to play someone else's Net Yaroze game, you would need the entire Net Yaroze development setup complete with PC to do so. There was no easy way just to burn a CD and run it, and there was no player software that came with the Net Yaroze itself. But in late 1987, as a way to promote the service, Net Yaroze games and demos started appearing on official UK PlayStation magazine. Each month, there would be some new games, and because they were so small, it was easier to fit 3 to 6 games on a disc each month. Finally, there was a way for everyone to play the games without requiring a Net Yaroze, a development kit, and a PC. It's rumoured that there were thousands of games and demos made on the Net Yaroze. Most of them weren't very good, but there were some impressive standouts. Hover Racing was inspired by F-Zero and Wipeout. Developed by Satu Tomogasu, it's a fast game that runs at 60 FPS, has 9 tracks, 4 vehicles and even 2-player split screen. All of this fits in 2 MB of RAM. Another popular game was TERRA Incognita, a Japanese RPG tech demo developed by Team Fatal, led by Mitsuru Kamiyama, who later became the director of Final Fantasy Crystal Chronicles for Square Enix. Kamiyama-san saw an advertisement in a magazine and bought the hardware even though he couldn't afford to keep the electricity on in his home. Over in the UK, thousands of bedroom coders and indie developers were working on their creations. For me, the best games include Total Soccer. This is essentially a very similar game as Sensible Soccer or Kickoff on the Amiga. The game was developed by Chris Chapman, and the gameplay, the graphics and the options really show the work that was put in. Chris went on to run his own development studio, First Touch Games, and Total Soccer is a great showcase of what the Net Yaroze is capable of. One very popular game was BLITTER. This one is a mix of Alien Syndrome, Gauntlet and Zombies Ate My Neighbors. Shoot the Aliens and Rescue the Kids is the name of the game. It's an impressive arcade shooter developed by Chris Chadwick. The game went on to win the 1998 Game Developer UK competition, and Chris pocketed a cool $10,000 for his trouble. Psycon by Ben James is an obvious clone of Alien Breed on the Amiga, but it's a fantastic shooter in its own right and definitely one of the better Net Yaroze games out there. Ben's story goes all the way back to the 8-bit computer generation with the Amstrad CPC writing basic programs. Ben wanted to break into game development and figured getting hold of a Net Yaroze would be the best way to do so. Ben went on to develop 8 games for the Net Yaroze, with 4 of them being featured on the official PlayStation Mag demo discs. TIMESLIP is another one of my favourites. It's a platform game where you must jump and shoot at enemies. To reach the end of the level you must collect a certain amount of coins, but what makes the game so interesting is the time warp mechanic. For each passing minute in the game, your previous movements are replayed. This mechanic allows you to open doors and switches that you normally wouldn't be able to. This gameplay mechanic allows you to progress through the level. The game is not great graphically, but it's damn addictive and one of the better Net Yaroze games. The game was developed by David Johnson, who started coding on a BBC Micro in his earlier years. David developed several games for the Net Yaroze and later went on to develop some well-known Xbox Live Arcade games. Over in the USA, things were a little less popular. There was no official PlayStation magazine, but there was the PlayStation Underground CD, which sometimes would contain videos and Net Yaroze games. A 3D graphic artist named John Byank reached out to me to let me know about a game that he made called Light Cycle Arena with two of his friends when they were in college in the late 90s. John, his roommate, and programmer Kevin Davis, who owned a Net Yaroze, all worked on the game together. The programmer really wanted to challenge himself with the AI of the enemy bikes. Once the game was completed, they sent the game to Sony for approval. Sony really liked the game and wanted to add it to the next PlayStation Underground CD. However, Sony asked for quite a few changes to be added to the game, something that the team wasn't keen on doing, so the game never made it. The developer was kind enough to share the game for me in this episode, and to his knowledge, the game has never been shown anywhere else before. With that, I'll leave a link to download it in the description below. But if we're talking about success stories, the biggest one undoubtedly must be Devil's Dice. This game began as a Net Yaroze project, but Sony Computer Entertainment picked up the game and developer Shift went on to release a full retail version for the PlayStation 1 worldwide. Shift later went on to develop the God Eater series and more recently Code Vein in 2019. I heard other stories from developers that the Net Yaroze was what got them hired in the games industry. And that's exactly what Sony was looking for. Sony knew that these people were out there and the Net Yaroze connected them with each other. It forced developers to think outside the box, to optimize code and come up with a cool demo, to learn about the hardware and how to get the best out of it. It prepared them for the industry and what was an important first step into a bigger world. If you landed a demo on a magazine disc, you would bring that disc as part of your job interview. Today, the Net Yaroze service has long been sunset, but its legacy lives on. Many games that started on the hardware now are available on iOS, Windows and Android. Sony has never been afraid to experiment with their hardware and open it up to the hobbyist bedroom coder. The Net Yaroze was the first, but a very important step to reach these people. This continued with the PlayStation 2 and 3 and even on the PlayStation Vita, which we will cover in a future episode. Now before I go, I want to give thanks to some of the Net Yaroze developers that reached out to me and let me know their stories and gave some good insight as to how things were done back in the late 90s. First of all, John Byank, who was gracious enough to share the Tron game with me, something that he believes has never been shown before, and I'll have a link to that game in the description below, as well as Ben James from the UK, who let me know about his experiences with the Net Yaroze. I'll have a link to his channel as well in the description below. There were some other developers that reached out that preferred to remain nameless, and that's totally fine, but I want to thank everyone that reached out to me in the Twitter DMs or email that let me know about their Net Yaroze story. It was so cool and fascinating to go back and revisit and tell the story of this consumer grade development kit that people literally in their bedrooms or in their garages, in their homes, were writing games for the Sony PlayStation in the hopes that they would get picked up by Sony or land themselves a job in the video game industry, or even just tinkering around and messing around and getting familiar with 3D graphics and getting familiar with APIs. It's definitely a cool story to tell and one that I hope you guys really enjoyed. Well guys, that will do it for this video. I hope you enjoyed it. Let me know what you thought about it in the comments below. As always, don't forget to like and subscribe, and I'll catch you guys in the next video. Bye for now.